Chapter 1. The inciting incident I have always held as a rule of life, that one should never underestimate the power of a single evening to turn the comfortable world of the respectable upside down. It was on such an evening, clear, warm, and perfumed with the faint, theatrical scent of grease paint and old velvet, that the affair began which, in the end, would draw from my friend Hercule Poirot one of his most delicate and cruelly exquisite dissections of human motive. The setting was the prestigious Marlowe Theatre, perched like a jewel in the heart of London's more refined quarter. That night, the curtain would rise on the folded stage, a new play by the celebrated, if somewhat eccentric, dramatist Celestine Fairbairn. The press had been invited. Patrons were dressed with the kind of careful abandonment that let the diamonds gleam without ostentation, and a certain expectant murmuring had collected in the plush foyer like a gathering tide. There was, too, a peculiar undercurrent of tension, thin as silk thread, but there, which I would have dismissed altogether if not for the acute observation of Poirot, who had traveled with me to the theatre on the pretense of seeing the drama, and, I suspected even then, to see what drama might unfold behind the scenes. The play, in its first act, unfolded like a carefully folded letter, every gesture measured, every silence weighted. The audience, elegantly arrayed, leaned forward and then relaxed in the shared comfort of being viewers rather than participants. It was during the small interval between acts, when the clusters of society lingered with glasses in hand and murmured about the brilliance of the leading actress, Isadora Kent, and the strange, beautiful presence of the play's financier, Lord Albright, that the scream came. It split the air as if a fine crystal had been shattered. Conversation stilled like a held breath. I, earnest and quick to react, turned toward the sound, thinking it might be an overexcited patron, or perhaps a misstep from a nervous debutante. Poirot, however, with his small, precise hands folded over his waistcoat, did not hurry. He lifted his eyes with that peculiar economy of motion of his, noted the direction, and, softly, with a slight pressure of his elbow, guided me toward the eastern wing where the sound had clearly echoed from beneath the stage. We descended a narrow, creaking service corridor. Passing in silence, the agitated stagehands whose clipped orders faltered in the face of fear. A faint odor of damp wood and oil paint rose from the unlit depths, mingled with a colder scent, something like the sharpness of crushed mint, an oddness that would not have registered at all with a less attentive mind. The stage manager, a thin man with a face like creased parchment and eyes too large in their sockets, met us at the hatch. His fingers trembled so that the cigarette between them leaned like a compromised alibi. "It's Miss Kent," he murmured, as if saying it louder might make the fact more real. "She was in the second scene." Then there was a sound, a faint rustle. We thought perhaps a prop had fallen. When we went to look, he stopped, swallowed, and the silence that followed was a kind of confession. We opened the hatch. The space beneath the stage was low and narrow, a shadowed lattice of beams and ropes, where the machinery of illusion breathed like a half-forgotten myth. There, curled near the folded edge of the massive curtain that separated the world of performance from the hidden underbelly, lay Isadora Kent. Her face was pale, the perfect makeup smeared into a thin, unsettling mask of fatigue and a single dark smudge at her temple. She was not yet dead. Her breath came in shallow, irregular draws. A faint, almost imperceptible bruise bloomed under the delicate skin of her wrist, as if someone had gripped too hard. Beside her, the heavy curtain sagged, weight apparently shifted. its hem a dark, damp ribbon on the floor. Poirot bent, not with hurried concern, but with the calm intensity of a man assembling a puzzle. He placed his gloved fingers lightly over her pulse. Simply, precisely. "Elle respire," he said, and the words carried no surprise, only a statement. He slid one careful finger under her eyelid. The pupil reacted sluggishly, telling him what the others might not yet have admitted. She had been struck, but not heavily enough to cause instant death. Something else had been intended. I knelt beside him, heart thumping like the anxious percussion of a theater overture. "Who would do such a thing beneath the curtain?" I whispered. "She is the leading light of the production. To attack her here is to commit a cruelty that is both intimate and theatrical." Poirot's eyes, small and black as polished jet, moved with minute rapidity, taking in the position of her body, the faint smudge of a scent. That sharpness I had noticed in the corridor, tracing the small cluster of dust disturbed near her head, and the precise fold of the stage curtain's hem. He lifted, with the gentlest motion, the corner of that hem. There, half concealed by the thick velvet, lay a small scrap of paper, its edge carefully torn, and its surface, in spite of the damp, surprisingly dry. He retrieved it with that same discretion and unfolded it, revealing a single sentence written in a quick, slanted hand. "The truth will bleed where the stage is folded." There was no signature. The ink, however, carried a faint metallic tang, a detail Poirot noted with an almost private click of appreciation from his mental mechanisms. "Ah, mon cher Hastings," he murmured, not looking at me but at the trembling curl of the curtain. "You see, no accident here. There is a message." He did not even then speak of motive, of who might wish the actress harm, or what secrets her performance might hide. He only looked so quietly that I almost failed to see it, at the small, almost invisible impression on the underside of the scrap, where the paper, when folded, had pressed against something. There was a faint, triangular indentation, as if the paper had rested over the corner of a small object, perhaps a pin or a badge, and had been removed in haste. The shape, so slight, might have been dismissed by anyone less exacting. Above us, in the world of chandeliers and murmured approval, the second act would soon begin. Below, beneath the folded stage curtain, a different drama had opened, one not scripted, where the audience was not yet aware they were all players in a far more dangerous performance. Poirot's lips curved, almost imperceptibly, in a manner that was not quite a smile. "Nous avons commencé," he said softly. We had begun. Chapter 2. Early Inconsistencies. The little theater beneath the Marlowe's velvet gloss had in that moment become a place where appearance and reality stood on opposite sides of a thin, trembling line. Isadora Kent's breath, shallow and irregular, marked time like the ticking of a metronome set too slow. The stage manager had fled upstairs to summon the doctor and the police. The actors, still in partial costume, clustered near the wings with expressions that wavered between alarm and carefully arranged composure. The audience, ignorant of the danger that had brushed so close, rustled above as the orchestra lifted its instruments in preparation for the next act. Poirot, with his methodical calm, had already set a perimeter in his mind. "Hastings," he said, his voice low and almost conversational, though every muscle in him was alert, "you will fetch the inspector. I desire him to observe, yes, but not to disturb. I prefer to examine first what the others have done in their own small theaters of truth." I went obediently to the narrow iron staircase that led up to the main level. On the way, I encountered Lady Penelope Ashcroft, a patron known for her benevolent sponsorship of the dramatic arts, her gloved hand gripping the banister, as if to steady herself against a shock she could not yet name. Her eyes, when they met mine, flicked over the scene with the rapid scan of someone cataloging details for later use. I guided her gently back, whispering assurances I hardly believed for myself. Above, the murmur had thickened. Someone had noticed the absence of the leading lady, and murmured speculation was already sharpening like knives unseen. Poirot had not touched Isadora's person beyond what was necessary to ascertain condition, yet even that minimal contact had produced subtleties. He had, I saw now as I returned, removed nothing, and yet the way he had positioned his own little gray cells around the space had already created a web of possibilities. He stood, hands behind him, looking not at the actress, but at the folds of the curtain, the shadowed niche where the scrap had been found, and the spattered irregularity of dust on the beam above her head. She was struck, I heard him say quietly to himself, but not here. He tapped the small bruise at her wrist with a gloved fingertip, then directed my gaze to the hem of the curtain which, though heavy, lay slightly shifted, not uniformly, but with a small asymmetry at the left where the velvet bunched in a way that suggested someone had disturbed it in a hurry, then attempted, poorly, to restore order. Why would a person come beneath the stage, I asked, if they meant simply to strike and depart? The place is cramped, hidden, and dangerous. It is not the sort of place for impulsive cruelty. Poirot's eyes, which seemed to have lenses of their own, turned to me with a mild impatience that was not unkind. "Mon ami," he said, "violence is always a performance. The stage is not only above us. Here, a smaller stage exists. The attacker desired witness, and yet desired denial. See the fingerprint? No, not the obvious one on the railing. See here," and he pointed with the smallest of motions to a faint smudge of powder near the corner of the curtain's clasp, the very edge of flour. It speaks of rehearsals, of a prop that required dusting, no? But the dust is too fresh for the morning's preparations. Someone touched here within minutes. And the scent. Do you smell the faintest trace of almond under the damp? A perfume? Or poison? I blurted, the word escaping before I could shape it with the calm of reason. Poirot's eyebrow flicked. No, not yet. The scent is not of death. It is of someone who uses scent as mask. See how the small piece of paper had indentation, yes? Someone placed it over something sharp. They wanted the message found, and yet they wanted you to see the impression and think of weight. It is misdirection of the mind, Hastings. Always the mind. Before the inspector arrived, a young actress from the supporting cast, Marianne Clive, had been brought down. Her face, usually bright with the naive glow of rising fame, was pale, and her hands fluttered in little nervous motions. She claimed she had heard nothing from below. She had been in the wings, adjusting her costume, and had seen Isadora enter the second scene with the usual flourish. Her eyes, however, when Poirot looked at her, betrayed a tiny hesitation, a blink just a beat later than expected, when she said the word usual. Poirot nodded slowly, as if confirming an internal hypothesis, and then said nothing. He needed no dramatic cross-examination yet. The smallest rebuke, the smallest twitch, would surrender more than a full confession. The inspector, a wide man with a tie slightly askew and a courteous, practiced confusion on his face, arrived with the requisite official gravity. He was Inspector Merton of Scotland Yard, whom I had met on several previous cases, efficient if sometimes too ready to seize on a convenient narrative. He looked down, saw Isadora's condition, and his mind leapt, as minds often do, to a ready explanation. "Attempted assault, sir," he declared aloud, addressing a crowd that had begun to trickle down despite the orders. Someone tried to frighten her, perhaps to spoil the opening. A jealous rival, perhaps a disgruntled admirer. This is not murder yet. Bring her up, get the doctors, seal the stage. Poirot inclined his head, and with the most gentle of voices said to Merton, "Inspector, yes, yes, but you will allow that in such matters the obvious is often the preparation for the invisible. We will bring her up presently and see if the face of this jealous rival reveals its true color in the light. Meanwhile, I shall have a look where perhaps no one else has cared to look." Merton, flattered by Poirot's deference and eager to feel the warm glow of the case simplifying itself, nodded and sent 2 constables to elevate Isidora and to secure the access below. Poirot, still looking at the curtain, then turned his attention to another detail, a scrap of velvet caught strangely in the teeth of the hook that held the heavy drapery. The piece had no matching tear in any visible garment. It was small, the sort of fragment that could be dismissed, and yet Poirot's little gray cells had already given it weight. "He wants the audience above to believe in accident," Poirot said softly, "and below, the true drama continues unseen." He folded the scrap into his inner coat with a care that made me feel he was safeguarding not merely cloth, but a possibility. The air above still held applause, waiting to be coaxed back into performance. Below, the quieter audience of suspicion had been seated, and the first notes of an unseen score were being played, notes that would, in time, resolve themselves into the shape of motive, opportunity, and, perhaps, the identity of the unseen hand that had placed Isidora in that small, dreadful theater of pain. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. The theater, which a little while before had shimmered with velvet and laughter, now felt like a drawing-room converted into an inquisition. Word spread, always with the peculiar elasticity of society gossip, and the circle of those with a right to be present narrowed and thickened. Inspector Merton, eager to impose order upon the growing murmur, decreed that the principal players and those with access to the stage beneath the curtain should assemble in the small, gilded rehearsal salon adjacent to the main auditorium. It was there, beneath cracked gilt and a ceiling painted with cherubs caught in perpetual surprise, that the first formal congregation of suspects took shape. Celestine Fairbairn arrived with the languid grace of one accustomed to drama on demand. Her dress, a swath of deep emerald silk, moved as if by its own intention, and her eyes, sharp and elaborately amused, took in the room like a director surveying the set before action. She claimed to have been in her private box, watching the first act and browsing through notes for her next revision. Yet, when Poirot, with his soft precision, asked if any new tension had surfaced among the troupe that day, her smile narrowed by half a degree. "Art is, my dear Inspector," she said in a voice rolled like fine velvet, a mirror that sometimes shows one too much. "Isidora and we had disagreements. She wanted a change in the 3rd act. I told her the fold should remain as written. She is passionate. Passion is dangerous when untamed." She paused, letting the half-sentence drift. "But I would never wish harm." Her fingers, long and careful, toyed with a small fan that had no apparent tear matching the scrap of velvet Poirot had pocketed. He observed her without comment, already cataloguing the possibility The disagreement could serve as both motive and misdirection. Lord Albright, the financier of the production, followed. His aristocratic features were set in a mask of restrained agitation. He was a man used to exerting influence through the soft pressure of money, and yet here his control seemed for once uneasy. The play must go on, he declared, as if to remind himself of that truth. Isadora's injury, attempted or real, will harm the opening. I invested more than money. Reputation, too, is fragile. Poirot took note of the way Lord Albright's gaze flicked toward the curtain's heavy fold, then to the small group of actresses clustered by the window. "You were in the audience?" Poirot asked, with that peculiar courtesy that makes questions into observations. "I was," Albright said, "and I was watching Miss Kent. She had been withdrawn lately. She spoke of wanting the funding redirected, less spectacle, more subtlety. I thought it temperamental. I did not know she would be attacked beneath her own stage." He swallowed, and there was a momentary shadow over his expression, as if the idea of control being wrested from him was an affront beyond business. Lady Penelope Ashcroft arrived escorted by a young aide, her composure perfect, but her eyes restless beneath the lace of her veil. She had been a patron of the theater for years, her donation plaques gleaming in the foyer as testament to her support. "The theater is a sanctuary," she murmured, "and yet tonight it has been violated." She spoke fondly of Isadora, praising her talent and temperament, but the little flicker over her right eyebrow when Celestine's name was mentioned betrayed something more complicated, an acknowledgment, perhaps, of the tensions artistic generosity nurtures. Giles Morton, the stage manager, was summoned. His usual command had dissolved into a damp, nervous obedience. He admitted that the understage mechanisms had been inspected that morning, that the curtains had been dressed, that the props had been placed with ritualistic care. He insisted that no one unauthorized had been below that afternoon, yet when Poirot asked about the rehearsal schedule, Giles was slightly vague on the presence of a particular junior technician, Arthur Keyes, who had been seen near the eastern wing earlier. Giles corrected himself too quickly when pressed about Keyes's absence from the room now, a correction that, in Poirot's mind, was not a clarification but a concealment. Marianne Clive, though still pale from the shock of having been questioned earlier, was present again, now in a sickly attempt to appear composed. She claimed that Isadora had been nothing but charming to her, even encouraging. Yet, when Lord Albright's earlier remark about funding surfaced, Marianne's fingers twisted a delicate handkerchief until the edges dampened with her own sweat. "She felt the strain," she whispered to me later, as if sharing a secret meant only for my ears. "Everyone says success is bright, but sometimes it is the shadow beneath that presses hardest." Inspector Merton, eager to reduce the number of loose threads, suggested the presence of the playwright's nephew, Edward Fairbairn, who had been handling aspects of the publicity and had access to all areas of the theater. Edward arrived, thin, nervous, his suit slightly rumpled as if he had spent too long in hurried transit. He stammered that the publicity campaign had been going well, save for some gossip columns threatening to suggest that the production's funding was unstable. He admitted that he had seen Miss Kent near her dressing area arguing in hushed tones with a shadowy figure the day before. Though he could not name the figure and insisted the argument concerned nothing of consequence, each introduction layered upon the last, and beneath the polite exchange lay subterranean currents. Celestine's argument with Isadora, Lord Albright's control threatened by artistic demands, Lady Penelope's patronage colored by a need for influence, Giles's evasive mention of keys, Edward's vague witness to a prior dispute, all formed a loose lattice of possible motives. Poirot, who had listened with an outward patience that hid the internal spinning of his little gray cells, allowed them to speak amongst themselves. He noted a tremor in Lady Penelope's voice when the name of the financier was mentioned, a subtle tightening of Giles Morton's jaw at Edward's uncertainty, a faint, almost imperceptible signal of resentment in Lord Albright's manner when Isadora's artistic will was discussed. He did not, however, mention any of it aloud. He simply, with that quiet gravity, asked for the list of those with access to the stage and the names of every person who had been in the wings in the last 24 hours. He requested that the dressing rooms remain untouched and that the curtains underfold be examined without alteration. His questions were small levers, gentle yet precise, and while the others answered, the room felt as if it were a stage set for something still to play out, a suspense held taut, waiting for the sigh that would release it. The gathering, ostensibly for clarity, had only sharpened the fog. Each person present was in some fashion both witness and participant, and beneath the niceties unspooled threads that might, if followed, reveal more than one secret. Poirot, with his slight smile unseen by most, began placing each of those threads in the quiet compartment of his mind, arranging them not yet into accusation, but into positions where they might be tested. Chapter 4. Poirot's First Impressions. It would have been a gross misrepresentation to say that Hercule Poirot had not already been present. Yet, until that moment, when the gathered suspects felt the subtle shift from mere curiosity to being under gentle examination, his arrival was not fully realized. He had been like a fine instrument, tuned and held beneath the surface. Now, with a quiet gesture that was almost imperceptible, he made his presence the axis upon which the evening might turn. He rose from his place near the heavy drapery, the scrap of velvet tucked out of sight in his inner pocket, and allowed his gaze to fall in sequence, not in haste, upon each person in the salon. It was not the casual glance of a man who surveys a room. It was the systematic, silent accounting of one who, in the span of a heartbeat, has already placed every feature, every hesitation, every small mannerism into a private ledger. The effect on the company was subtle. None of them recoiled, but all felt as if an unseen light had been focused so that small imperfections could no longer hide in the shadows. "My friends," he began, and even in those two words there was the smallest of inflections, the courtesy of a host before bringing forth a difficult truth. "You are all, in a manner, performers. The stage above us gives applause. Yes, but the stage below, it gives secrets. It is necessary that we speak plainly. The official theory that Miss Kent has been the victim of a random attack, perhaps by a jealous admirer or overzealous critic, is, how shall I say, insufficient. The truth is never satisfied with insufficient. It is, I believe, deliberate." Inspector Merton, who had been prepared to let the matter settle into a comfortable assumption, straightened. "Deliberate? You mean someone came specifically to harm her?" His tone held the faint, defensive warmth of a man whose case is being complicated. Poirot's small mustache quivered as he allowed a half-smile. You see, Inspector, I am not yet saying who. I only say this. The place beneath the curtain is not a casual space for violent impulse. It is a place one enters with intention, and one leaves carrying something. In this case, not simply a wounded actress, but a message. He lifted, just enough for those nearest to notice, the scrap of paper with its cryptic sentence. "It is the first act of a different play." The writer of this act wanted attention. He, or she, desired that the message be found, and yet, yes, that the true hand remain invisible. He turned then to Celestine Fairbairn. "Madame, you have passion, and passion sometimes becomes the instrument of manipulation. Your disagreement with Miss Kent, was it over the fold in the third act only, or was there something beneath the fold that disturbed you?" Celestine's smile remained, but a breath, small and almost inaudible, left her. "The fold, Monsieur Poirot, is itself a thing of layers. There are many that wish it to appear as it seems." She did not deny the argument. She did not offer more. The balance was maintained, yet a tiny shadow crossed her face, like a stage light passing over a painted backdrop. Poirot's eyes moved to Lord Albright next. "You are a financier accustomed to guiding the currents of influence. Was Miss Kent's request for reallocation of funds a request born of genuine belief in a different vision? Or was it, perhaps, the surface expression of a pressure placed upon her by another?" Albright's fingers, which had been drumming ever so slightly along the edge of his chair, stilled. "She wanted less spectacle, Monsieur Poirot," he said quietly. "She believed the truth of the story would impress more without the adornment. I thought it temperamental. If there is something beneath, I did not see it." There was an effort in the way he spoke, as if the act of saying might push back something that had tried to enter his carefully ordered world. Lady Penelope Ashcroft, who had been watching the exchanges with measured grace, inclined her head. "The sanctuary of theater demands stewardship," she offered. "I simply wish that the stewardship here not be poisoned by hidden plots." Her attention, though, flicked briefly to Giles Morton, then to the empty doorway where Arthur Keyes's absence still hung like an unasked question. Giles, visibly uncomfortable under the scrutiny, cleared his throat. "Everyone has access in rehearsal times. Arthur, Mr. Keyes has been helpful. There was confusion earlier about the scheduling. I can supply the list." He did supply, and Poirot accepted it with the lightest of nods. Yet the way Giles's lips pressed when he said the nephew's name was not lost on him. Edward Fairbairn's nervousness, until then a background noise, became a more defined note. "I saw a small quarrel, yes," he began, "but it was between Miss Kent and a gentleman I could not identify." They spoke sharply. She was upset about the way her scene was being portrayed in the pamphlets. That is all. I did not think more of it." His eyes flicked involuntarily to Marianne Clive, who sat with her hands folded too tightly, her knuckles white beneath the lace. Marianne, having been allowed space but not yet questioned again, gave a soft, almost inaudible murmur of assent to nothing at all. Her fingers, still knotted in the memory of that spasm, betrayed her discomfort in the small shifting of her posture. Poirot watched her, not pressing, not needing to yet. He had seen enough to know that people reveal more when they think nothing is being sought. He finished his initial survey not with accusation, but with an elegant reshaping of focus. "We shall proceed," he declared, "with interviews. Each of you will speak with me, not to confess, no, but to allow the little gray cells to patter gently over what is true and what is shadow. I request that nothing be moved in the rooms of performance or preparation until I have seen them. The curtains underfold," he lifted a finger, not pointing in blame but in attention, "must remain as it is. The truth, mes amis, dislikes being hurried. It prefers to be invited." There was a rustle of agreement. Inspector Merton, though miffed by the complication, was buoyed by the structure Poirot offered. The suspects, each in their quiet way, settled into the roles that society had long rehearsed for them: patron, artist, financier, manager, nephew, supporting actress. But beneath the surface, like the faint vibration of a hidden string, something had shifted. Poirot's arrival, now fully acknowledged, had unsteadying effect. The comfortable story of jealous rivalries was no longer sufficient. The audience below the floorboards was watching, and so was he. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The small salon, having served its purpose as the theater for the first act of observation, gave way to a quieter, more deliberate series of exchanges. Poirot's plan unfolded not with the loud bang of authority, but with the soft, inexorable pressure of a tide creeping over stones. He began, as he always did, not with the most obvious suspect, but with the smallest ripple: Marianne Clive. She was brought gently back into the room, her cheeks flushed not from heat but from the strain of performance without applause. Poirot offered her a chair, arranged the folds of her skirt with the delicacy of a man setting a stage prop, and then, with the most courteous of inclinations, asked her to speak of Miss Kent as if she were describing a piece of music: tempo, nuance, and inflection. Marianne spoke of Isadora's kindness, her single-minded devotion to the part, and the way she had touched the hem of the curtain before going on as if seeking comfort from its coolness. When Poirot asked if anything had seemed different in her manner recently, her eyes flicked not to him, but to the far corner of the room where the heavy drapery hung like an unspoken question. She was tired, Marianne said, and then added, with a small breath, and she was afraid. Not of the play, but of something behind it. She spoke of whispers in the wings. She said she felt watched. The last word was barely audible. Poirot, his fingers steepled, did not ask who whispered. He did not demand the source. He let the idea sit, like a tone held long enough that the ear begins to anticipate the next. Edward Fairbairn's interview was next. He arrived with that slight tremor of a man who has rehearsed his own innocence too often. Poirot had him describe the argument he'd seen, not for its heat, but for the pattern of its cadence. Edward spoke of the sharpness in Isadora's words, the way she raised her hand as if to push away something intangible, and the shadowy figure he could not name, only the cut of the coat, the sound of a voice swallowed too quickly when a door opened. Poirot, without rushing him, asked about the pamphlets Edward had mentioned earlier. Edward's nervous hands betrayed that there was more, a promise of scandal he had not wished to name. They were to suggest instability, Edward confessed softly, but I do not know if the source was from outside or within. Miss Kent was concerned that the criticism would be used to undermine her. Poirot's little gray cells moved, connecting another quiet dot. The appearance of gossip, the pressure to control narrative, and the small, unseen hands that might manipulate both. Lord Albright's audience was by contrast contained in measured, economical words. Poirot asked him simply to recount the last days of his interactions with Isadora. Albright spoke of her asking for the reduction of spectacle, her insistence that the truth of the story, unmarred by ornament, would gain deeper resonance. He admitted that he had felt slighted, but not threatened, an important distinction. She spoke of a secret, Albright added, though she would not elaborate. She said if certain things came to light, the entire production would seem as if it had been staged by someone else entirely. Poirot's expression remained calm. It was not the content of the secret yet, but the fact that she had perceived a threat so intangible that it could not be named, and had connected it to the play's deeper structure. Celestine Fairbairn followed, and here Poirot's approach was softer, as though he wished to coax a truth from a reluctant partner in creation, rather than drag it from a guilty throat. She spoke of the tension, yes, but of her own frustration at a leading actress who wanted alteration without understanding the architecture she interfered with. "Isadora is fire," she said. "She wishes to illuminate, and sometimes the light blinds her to the frame. I have enemies too, Monsieur Poirot. There are those who think the mirror should show only beauty and not the cracks beneath." Her gaze, when it touched his, held something like a dare, and he did not take it as defiance, but as information. The person who sees the reflection also knows where surface and fracture meet. Lady Penelope Ashcroft, in her quiet elegance, was next. Poirot asked about her patronage, her involvement, and her recent observations. She spoke of the necessity of guardianship and of subtle tensions between those who take and those who give. She admitted she had noticed a change in Giles Morton's manner, a slight defensiveness when the subject of access arose, and a thin, almost imperceptible tremor in her own voice when she referenced the financial backing. "Control," she murmured, "is the most dangerous illusion of all when one believes it absolute." Poirot did not pry, but he stored her phrasing, illusion, absolute, alongside Albright's mention of being slighted and Isadora's fears of being watched. Giles Morton, when he came, offered the rehearsed version of the day's logistics. Poirot allowed him to speak, then asked about the absent Arthur Keyes in a manner that suggested confusion rather than accusation. Giles's correction about the scheduling and oversight came too quickly, too precisely. "He was here," Giles insisted. "He is useful. There was a mix-up in the lists. The confusion is mine." Poirot's brow lifted faintly. He did not press further, but he made a quiet mental note of the speed with which responsibility had shifted, and the way the word "mix-up" drifted like a smoke-screen over something more deliberate. The interviews, thus begun, were not interrogations in the vulgar sense. There were no raised voices, no dramatics. Poirot's questions were small wrenches, turned gently in the machinery, each designed to reveal whether the gears slipped or held. He listened not only to what was said, but to the spaces between, the brief pause before Edward's mention of the shadowy figure, Marianne's lowered eyes when she spoke of being watched, the slight hesitation in Celestine's voice before the word architecture. When the last of this particular round concluded, he gathered the little scraps of information like threads being held before the weaving begins. He did not yet speak of his deductions. Instead, with the same soft authority, he arranged for the next sequence. Each of the others would be questioned in turn, and all would be asked, separately, to recount what they had noticed about the curtain's position and any unusual arrivals or departures in the hours prior. The game, as it had been since the beginning, was subtle. The players believed themselves to be recounting harmless fragments, while Poirot, patient and precise, arranged them into a pattern he could only see as the pieces slowly aligned in his mind. Chapter 6. The first false lead, the afternoon, which had begun with quiet interviews and polite pretense, shifted, as if a new scene had been dropped in from a different author. Word traveled fast in the theater. A murmur, hushed at first, swelled into a ripple that reached even the deeper corridors. The arrival of a young technician, Arthur Keyes, was announced with the same breathless gravity reserved for a revelation. He was brought in, flushed, defensive, his hands awkwardly folded as if trying to hide the small object clenched in his fist. Giles Morton followed closely, the unease in his steps no longer subtle. Arthur, whom Giles had previously described with a nervous half-apology as helpful, now looked like a trapped insect under glass. In his pocket, the constables found a small bundle of folded playbills, ones that had not yet been distributed, and beneath them a length of thin wire bent into a crude hook. Its end darkened with a faint smear that resembled dried adhesive. The hook matched, in a vague and troubling way, the one that held the heavy curtain's underfold in place. More damning, perhaps, in the theater's whispering logic, was the fact that the wire bore a tiny trace of the same faint almond scent Poirot had already noted beneath the stage. Arthur's protests tumbled out in breathless bursts. "I didn't do anything to Miss Kent," he insisted, eyes darting from face to face. "I was only checking the rigging. The hook, yes, I handled it. It was loose. I tightened it. I had nothing to do with her being hurt. Those playbills were mine. I was to place them in the program. I found the scrap of velvet earlier and was going to give it to Giles. I swear I was going to say something about the scheduling mix-up." He stopped, because the room had shifted its focus to him, and in that stillness the shape of guilt was being etched by assumption, not by proof. Inspector Merton, delighted to have a convenient narrative, stepped forward with the speed of one who had been waiting for confirmation of his earlier hunches. "See," he declared, louder than the situation warranted. "Here is someone with access, someone with a tool connected to the curtain, someone carrying incriminating paraphernalia. He was near the fold. He had the scent. He had motive. If the production is ruined, the chaos that follows helps certain ambitions." He let the last phrase hang, an implication that readiness to benefit equaled readiness to act. Marianne Clive, who had been listening, felt the air tighten. Edward Fairbairn's face paled slightly, and Lord Albright's lips compressed. Celestine, with the practiced control of a ringmaster, watched the younger man's agitation. Lady Penelope's eyes, though calm, flicked momentarily to Giles, then back to Arthur, as if measuring the lengths of the threads now pulled taut. Poirot did not move immediately to join the general chorus of condemnation. He let the insinuations settle like dust. Then, with the smallest of motions, he stepped closer to Arthur, who shrank fractionally. "Monsieur Keyes," Poirot said softly, "you are a man of the theater, oui? You know how things may appear, and how they may be arranged to appear thus. You have touched the wire, n'est-ce pas? You have felt its looseness. You found the scrap. You were going to mention the scheduling confusion. All this is true, yes? But tell me, why, if you had meant to bring the velvet to Giles, did you not do so earlier? Why did you hold it?" Arthur blinked, confusion making his speech a stammer. I thought it was nothing. I thought perhaps someone dropped it. I was nervous about the schedule. I wanted to be sure before I disturbed anything. I thought the hook was loose and might fall in performance. I had no reason to." His voice trailed. The room, already leaning toward the convenient interpretation of his guilt, filled in the rest. Poirot turned then, not with the flourish of revelation, but with the quiet redirection of a man who sees a pebble in a stream and is more interested in the current than the obstruction. He lifted the small wire hook, examining it with the almost imperceptible attentiveness of a jeweler weighing a gem. "The wire," he said, "is bent. Yes, it was used, but not for this purpose." Look here." He held it toward the inspector, indicating a nearly invisible smear along the inner curve, an oily residue that, under the scrutiny of a trained eye, suggested that something had been wound and unwound repeatedly, not with the clumsy desperation of a saboteur, but with a practiced hand used to precision. "The scent," he continued, "is not on the wire itself, but in the fabric of the folded playbills. Someone carried perfume on their hands when handling those bills. The wire has been handled as part of routine maintenance. That is why Monsieur Keyes had it. He is, as he says, responsible for the rigging. He does not deny his access. He does not deny handling things. But to claim he is the attacker because he held a tool is to confuse the actor with the author." Inspector Merton, who had been basking in the apparent neatness of his case, flushed. "Then who?" "Ah, mon ami," Poirot interjected lightly, "we are not at the point of who. We are at the point of what. The false lead is useful, yes, for it reveals what the others will say when they believe the matter settled. Monsieur Keyes, you will remain available. But I request that you be escorted not as a prisoner, but as one whose movements we may observe. The true movement, perhaps, will be seen when others react to your shadow." The room, in the wake of the paused accusation, buzzed with reluctant recalibration. Arthur, relieved but still trembling, was led aside with a guarded eye on him, as though he were a figure in a tableau whose true place had not yet been determined. Inspector Merton, embarrassed by the ease with which he had been guided from certainty to uncertainty, tried to reclaim posture. "So then," he muttered, "we watch." Poirot, his little gray cells turning with the faint satisfaction of a man who had not allowed the obvious to blind him, glanced at the curtains underfold again. The first convenient narrative had been exposed. In its place was not clarity, but a richer fog. That fog, to his mind, promised more intricate shapes, shapes that would require patience, and not the eager, brittle certainty of a premature conclusion. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The atmosphere, having been briefly unsettled by the convenient narrative involving Arthur Keyes, settled again into a more careful hush. The suspects now regarded one another with a new layer of suspicion, not merely of what they had done, but of what they might say next. Poirot, who had allowed the room to breathe that small moment of misdirection, began to play with the edges of their composure, as a conductor teases tension from a silent orchestra before the crescendo. He began not with the obvious, but with the personal. He summoned Edward Fairbairn back into the salon, and this time he did not ask Edward to recount what he had seen. He asked, instead, about the manner in which messages traveled in the theater. "You, Monsieur Edward," Poirot said, "are the one who takes the words of the story to the public. You are the one who arranges their shape so they may be believed. Tell me, what would be the effect, yes, if the audience believed the story had been manipulated from within before the curtain rose? Would it not change their sympathy? Would it not make them look behind where perhaps nothing wishes to be seen?" Edward's eyes shifted. He nodded in a measured way, and Poirot watched the faint droop at the corner of his mouth, the sort of detail that comes from someone who has wrestled with the idea of influence and then chosen the safer language of denial. "It would sour trust," Edward admitted. "It would make them suspicious of every hand that touched the paper." Poirot's smile, small and quiet, did not give anything away. The seed was not a question aimed at the nephew's guilt. It was a suggestion, a mirror held up so that Edward might glimpse the way perception could be steered. Next, Poirot sought Marianne Clive again, but he did not ask her about Isadora directly. He spoke to her instead of performance anxiety, of how one's inner voice could betray fear as strength, and how watchers above often misconstrue the trembling of a hand as intention. Marianne, who had once been a country girl with no design beyond applause, now found herself describing the little games actresses played to maintain composure. When Poirot casually mentioned that sometimes the one who appears most frightened hides a temper that could erupt like a controlled flame, Marianne's fingers flexed in a small, involuntary mimic of the movement. "Some fears," she whispered, "are not for the stage. They are for what hides in the wings." Poirot nodded, as if this were confirmation of a pattern rather than a confession of anything specific. He turned, then, to Lady Penelope Ashcroft. "You see, madame," he said, "people believe influence is always loud. They think it is the crash of a gavel or the thunder of opinion. But the most powerful currents flow unseen under the surface. Have you felt, perhaps, that the giving of support sometimes becomes the giving of expectation? That those who accept light must also accept the shadow it casts?" Lady Penelope's lips pressed together. "Yes," she replied slowly. "One does not give without collecting, but I have not used my giving to press upon anyone. I only watch. I only wish to ensure the fold is not being used as a cover." Poirot did not push her further, yet the quiet acknowledgment of the dynamic placed her in the mesh of interests, the benefactor who watches the beneficiaries in case the gratitude turns to control. It was during these delicate inquiries that Poirot set forth a conversational trap. He spoke, in passing, of the idea of staging insecurity. The clever criminal, he observed aloud so that others might hear, will create within a group the impression that the danger comes from one quarter, and while eyes are turned, the real movement happens elsewhere. When someone is accused too quickly, the rest breathe briefly, believing the story is closed, and then their guard drops. The mind is lazy in peace. The phrase was not aimed at a name, but the effect was palpable. Giles Morton, who had been lingering near the doorway, shifted slightly, his jaw tightening. Celestine Fairbairn's hand, which held the edge of her fan, slowed its ripple for a heartbeat. Lord Albright's stare, which had been directed toward the upper corners of the ceiling, as if to find comfort in architecture, returned with a small, measured tension to the room's center. Poirot allowed the moment to settle. Then, with a gentle pivot, he engaged Lord Albright directly. "You, monsieur, are one who understands that reputation is a fragile thing. If a threat is perceived, real or imagined, what is the natural course? To shore up? To reveal? Or to distract?" Albright's reply was careful, his words chosen like the placement of weights on a balance. "To control," he said finally. "One seeks not to panic the audience, but to steady them. Yet, if a story begins to twist beneath, the effort to steady becomes a pressure that distorts." Poirot's eyes gleamed only slightly. He had not accused the financier of causing the distortion. He had placed the notion of pressure, of distortion, into the space between them as a possibility that would ripple when touched by others. The psychological game, as Poirot played it, was not about catching someone in a lie immediately. It was about observing how each suspect responded when their internal tensions were reflected back to them in softened, indirect light. Some reacted with defensiveness, others with the instinct to clarify, "No, that is not what I meant." And a few simply remained still, revealing nothing outwardly, but allowing the other's discomfort to betray the network of anxieties. The greatest victories, Poirot believed, were those where the opponent did not know they had been moved until the move had already taken effect. As the hour deepened, he stepped back from the center of the little parlor and allowed the room to orbit the quiet unease he had seeded. He did not yet speak of Arthur Keyes's complication directly. He watched instead the way Giles Morton's hands folded when questions of access were coyly alluded to, how Marianne's gaze lingered on the curtain even while discussing the weight of expectation, and how Edward's sentences sometimes began with certainty and ended in a soft, unsure tone. When, finally, Poirot rose, he announced that the next stage would be a more structured series of private conversations, each suspect taken individually, with an emphasis not on accusation, but on the recounting of seemingly trivial movements. Who had come early, who had lingered in certain corners, who had pressed the hand of another in passing. "Le petit jeu continues," he whispered to me quietly as we stepped out of earshot. "The little game continues." He understood now, more than ever, that the truth was not in the loud confession, but in the subtle unease of those who had carefully rehearsed their roles and were now, under his soft pressure, beginning to falter in cadence. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. Just as the careful, quiet rhythm of Poirot's interrogations seemed to settle into a pattern of hesitation, correction, and mental rearrangement, the theater produced a new dissonant note, unexpected and sharp. It came not from beneath the curtain this time, but from the delicate tea service in the private green room, where Marianne Clive had withdrawn under the pretense of composing herself. The room, fragrant with the scent of boiled leaves and the residual warmth of stage lights, became suddenly colder. Marianne had been sipping from a porcelain cup, her fingers trembling slightly around the saucer, when she gave a soft, strangled sound and collapsed inward against the upholstered settee. It was not a dramatic fall, no shattering of glass, no theatrical clutching at pearls, but a slow, sinking surrender of muscle, her eyes widening with the look of one who sees the world tilt just enough to lose purchase. A servant raised the alarm with the furtive panic of someone who knows the machinery of theater superstition. Illness was unlucky. Accident was a scandal. Malice was ruin. Poirot had been in the adjoining corridor, watching Giles Morton through the half-open door, as the stage manager tried, with a trembling countenance, to reassure an increasingly nervous Lord Albright. He crossed the threshold at a measured pace, his small mustache barely stirring, and entered the green room with that peculiar stillness which causes tumult to hush. Marianne lay pale, her breath shallow but steady, a slight sheen of sweat on her brow, and beside her, on the low table, the remains of the tea service steamed faintly. "Ah," Poirot murmured, bending close. He did not startle her, nor did he overreact. He lifted the cup the servants had abandoned, its rim notched with the tiny impression of lipstick, and held it as if it were a delicate relic. "You see, Hastings," he said to me in a whisper that was meant for no one else, "the stage above is not the only one where acts are performed. Here, a nervous actor has been given a little fright." Marianne's eyelids fluttered. She was aware enough to whisper, "The tea, I thought it bitter. I tasted like almonds. I thought I imagined it. Then my head—" Her voice petered, and she turned her face toward the small window, the light making the whites of her eyes prominent. "Bitter almonds," Poirot repeated softly, tasting the phrase like a man assessing a spice. He did not say the name of any poison. He kept the shape of the thought just beyond articulation. He called for a doctor, but not with urgency, instead with calm direction. Bring a physician, yes, but leave the cup, the spoon, the pot. Move nothing. We will examine the small theater of this event." While the doctor arrived and began his measured ministrations, simple stimulants, cooling cloths, hushed questions, Poirot's gaze slid across the room. He noted the angle of the tray, the way the tea had been poured, not from the usual pot, which sat to the side clean, the slight smudge on the handle of Marianne's cup, where a fingerprint might have been washed away by heat, but left, perhaps, an impression in the glaze. He also, with the quiet acuity of one who watches how people approach crisis, observed the movements of those gathered outside the door. Lord Albright's clenched jaw, Celestine Fairbairn's slight tightening at the corners of her eyes, and Edward Fairbairn's sudden reddening as if a memory pricked him like a thorn. "She did not faint from fright alone," Poirot said, pacing once around the settee. "Some substance has entered the system quickly. The idea of weakness was invited, yet she did not collapse entirely. The dose was controlled, meant to alarm, perhaps to silence for a moment, not to kill. The question, to what end? To divert attention from the underlying investigation, or to frighten one who has seen too much? Giles Morton, standing near the doorway with a stiff posture, tried to look helpful. I had no idea," he protested. "She asked for tea. It is always the same blend. Someone could have brought it in. The greenhouse boy, he has access. Edward, perhaps." Poirot stopped him with the smallest lift of a gloved finger. "You speak quickly, monsieur. When the mind is guilty, it rushes. When it is innocent, it chooses its words like one arranges flowers, with care. Who served the tea?" "Marianne's dresser, Miss Lillian Avery," Giles answered. "She fetched the tea from the adjacent room. She left it there while she went to fetch a fresh lemon slice. When she returned, the cup was already on the tray. She thought Marianne had taken it." Lillian Avery arrived, breathless and pale. "I placed the pot," she said, "but I did not fill the cup. I left it to cut the lemon, and when I came back, the cup was there. Miss Clive had not been in the room long. She said nothing about the taste until—" Her gaze flicked toward Edward, then toward Celestine, and back to Poirot. "I did not see anyone. I did not touch her cup. I would never—" Poirot did not challenge her directly. He simply listened, folding the detail into the growing fabric of unease. Then he asked, casually, "Madame Fairbairn, you were near the corridor when the sound came, oui? You saw Marianne retreat here?" Celestine's response was measured. "She looked undone when she left," she admitted. "She had come to speak with me about the anxiety of the second act. She asked if the audience sees the difference between trembling that is part of a character and trembling that is part of a soul. I told her the difference is the honesty of the fear. I did not see anything more. I only heard her leave hurriedly." Edward, who had lingered awkwardly nearby, made a small movement as if to speak and stopped. Poirot's eyes flicked to him, just enough to encourage the continuation. "I went past the door," Edward said slowly, "and heard no sound. I saw no one go in. I was on my way to speak with the manager. Miss Clive had mentioned she felt watched. She had not yet told me why." Poirot collected the fragments. He did not yet speak the name of the message that had gone missing before this, an envelope Celestine had reported earlier as having contained a letter of uncertain importance, now nowhere to be found from her private box. He let the secondary disturbance, the fear injected into Marianne, sit beside the earlier puzzle. The two acted like parallel currents, sometimes pulling, sometimes pushing, but both suggesting that the environment of the theater was being manipulated not as random chaos, but as layers of a broader design, when Marianne's color returned slowly, and the doctor, after giving a careful, quiet opinion, allowed her to be moved, still under watch. Poirot stayed behind. He took the cup, turning it toward the light, and, with gloved fingertips, lifted the small, almost invisible ring of residue at its edge. He placed the porcelain aside, not yet revealing the importance of the faint trace of a fingerprint impression in the dried tea film, and stepped toward the curtain, placing his palm against the velvet as if to feel the pulse of the theater itself. "We have," he said without looking back at anyone, "a second act unfolding. The danger is no longer only beneath the fold. It is in the servant's hands, in the friendly cup. In the quiet spaces where one believes reassurance lies. The true author of this perturbation desires confusion, yes, but also silence. We must not give it either." Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The appearance of the secondary disturbance, Marianne Clive's sudden collapse, had cast a new, subtle shadow over the room. It was not merely that fear had been injected into the investigation, it was that the line between helper and hinderer had blurred, and, beneath the surface, polite deference, a lattice of relationships and debts had begun to show. Poirot, who had watched Marianne recover under cautious observance, now turned his attentions to the quieter webs linking the players, seeking what lay beneath the obvious tensions, the hidden connections, those small, invisible threads that stitched motives together and made them move as one. He began with a return to Lady Penelope Ashcroft, whose patronage of the theater had, until now, been a polite backdrop. He did not ask her directly about the poisoning. Instead, he spoke of gratitude. "Madame," he said, "you have given much to keep this stage alive. One who gives also receives something unseen. Does the one who receives sometimes lean upon the one who gives? Is there a silent understanding, perhaps, that gratitude grows into obligation?" Lady Penelope's composure flickered just enough to show that she understood the suggestion without answering it fully. "There is a dance," she said carefully. "I give and they perform. I do not ask for their lives, only their earnestness. But when the performance cracks, one hears whispers. Some think I demanded too much, others that I control too little." The phrasing, innocent sounding to a casual ear, placed her in a reciprocal pressure with the performers. She was not merely a patron, but a presence whose involvement shaped decisions in ways not always spoken. Poirot followed the thread from her to Celestine Fairbairn. "You sometimes speak of mirrors," he said, "and of seeing cracks. Does the reflection you offer ever force those reflections to shift? Do those who appear before your public perceive you as comfort or as judge?" Celestine's smile was tight for a moment. "I seek truth in art," she replied. "Truth, yes, but also obedience to the structure. Those who wish to change the structure must persuade the mirror, not the audience. Yet some look away from themselves and blame the frame." Her answer, layered, did not deny the pressure she could exert. It suggested that influence flowed both ways, the artist shaping the performer pushing back, the patron watching both. Edward Fairbairn's presence, until now a peripheral tremor, grew under examination. Poirot asked him about his uncle's influence, Lord Albright's, that is, on the publicity campaign. The whispers about instability, Edward admitted, they did not come from nowhere. There was a suggestion, yes, an encouragement to amplify certain criticisms so that the sudden shift in tone would make the later controversy seem like recovery, not destabilization. It would appear that the production had survived pressure, yes? The idea was to create a narrative where resilience could be shown, even if the pressure itself was engineered. Edward's gaze dropped. He had spoken as if revealing a theory, but the way his fingers drummed unconsciously against the arm of his chair betrayed discomfort with the part he had played in arranging the shapes of public perception. Lord Albright, who had been watching the exchange, shifted. "I never asked for destabilization," he protested, "only for the audience to appreciate the deeper truth. If the story seems manipulated, it is because it is complex. I sought to frame the narrative so that a question raised in one place could be answered more profoundly in another. If that caused whispers, they were unintended ripples." His shoulders loosened fractionally, but Poirot had heard the tension beneath the protest, the friction between shaping audience belief and being seen to shape it. Marianne, now steadied by rest but still fragile, was drawn into a different line of questioning. Poirot did not ask about the tea directly this time. He asked about what she had noticed in the interactions between Isidora and the others in the days prior. Marianne spoke of a sudden warmth in Isidora's behavior toward Lady Penelope, a deference unusually tender, followed by a retreat of confidence when Celestine entered the room. Isidora wanted approval, Marianne said. She craved the light, and that light came with a touch too heavy. Lady Penelope praised her in private, softly, kindly, but then sometimes seemed to withhold when others were present, as if measuring her worth. When Celestine arrived, Isidora's speech tightened. It was as if she were trying to reconcile two scripts at once. The suggestion of triangulation, that approval and pressure came from multiple directions and clashed, was the kind of knot Poirot delighted in untying later, when he had a clearer sense of the thread ends. Giles Morton's connection to Arthur Keyes, earlier a matter of scheduling confusion, took a more defined shape now. Poirot, choosing his words with care, asked Giles about the technician's actual duties and whether Arthur had ever been asked to do tasks outside his remit. Giles hesitated, just enough to signal the existence of an unspoken understanding, before admitting that Arthur had been asked to keep quiet about small irregularities during rehearsals. "We did not want scandals," Giles muttered. "Little things." "The public sees the surface, Monsieur Poirot. Sometimes you tidy the underside and do not speak of it." His explanation placed Arthur not as a lone actor, but as part of a small maintenance network that had been used to manage discrepancies quietly. Discrepancies that, when left unspoken, could later become fractures exploited by someone with intent. Poirot then turned to the left-out figure, the one whose absence still created a small hollow in the conversation, Isidora Kent. She had not yet been able to converse fully. Her condition, though improved, required gentle encouragement. When she finally entered, pale yet resolved, her eyes flicked from face to face, as if assessing the invisible alignments and choosing where to place her own small hesitations. She spoke softly of her own sense that someone had been too observant of her movements, not with the crude glare of jealousy, but with a delicate study that felt like being traced without consent. She admitted she had allowed a small part of herself to be swayed by promises of a more honest portrayal, promises she believed came from two directions. One from Celestine, coaxing her into subtle changes, and the other from an unnamed patron suggesting the truth could be clearer if certain elements were softened. She would not name that patron. Her silence, however, suggested perhaps that she felt tangled between the desire to please and the fear of being used. Poirot listened. He did not yet pronounce the connections as accusations. Instead, he folded them into his internal mapping, a precise cartography of influence. Each of these ties, patronage that felt like stewardship, public narrative shaped for resilience, backstage tidying masking deeper fault lines, and a leading actress caught between directives, suggested more than coincidence. They suggested an orchestration of pressure points, small and distributed, which, when nudged at key moments, could create the appearance of chaos while steering the overall perception. When the gathering of these revelations paused, Poirot leaned back slightly. "The truth," he said, "is like a theater's architecture. What is seen is supported by hidden beams. If one beam is shifted, the whole appears to tilt. We are now seeing which beams have been touched, perhaps not by the same hand, but in a pattern that may yet reveal the master builder." He allowed the sentence to rest in the room, watching as the interplay of unease and contemplation settled like dust after a breeze. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. The air, already heavy with layered suspicion, seemed to tighten around a new axis as Poirot withdrew from the obvious, quiet exchanges and retreated into his own interior theater. He spent a while alone in the dim corridor that ran behind the rehearsal salon, his small figure barely a shadow against the faded wallpaper. He had asked that no one disturb the curtains underfold and the dressing rooms. The world above and around him continued its murmur, but beneath his composed exterior, something had shifted. A tiny, previously unnoticed imbalance that now grew in significance. He called me to his side with that slight motion of the head which, in him, carried more authority than a shout. "Hastings," he said quietly, "we have been given many performances. The false lead, the faint poison, the strained connections, all are acts in a larger piece. But there is, I see, a secret clue. It is small. It is easily missed by those who seek the obvious. Come." He led me back beneath the heavy curtain, where the redundancy of velvet folded like the layers of a complicated lie. He did not immediately speak of the scrap of paper again. Instead, he bent, almost reverently, over the base of the stage, and traced with a gloved fingertip the line where the velvet met the wooden floor. "Look," he whispered. At first, I saw only the heavy drape, the dust, the darkened fibers of the hem. Then, as one grown accustomed to hearing the faintest sounds, I saw what he meant, a thin, almost invisible thread of crimson, threaded delicately into the underside of the fold, so faint that it had become part of the shadow, yet there. It was not paint, nor was it a stain from a clumsy spill. It lay along the seam as if placed there deliberately, like a secret signature, and its texture differed slightly from the surrounding weave. Poirot's eyes gleamed, not with the triumph of a solved puzzle, but with the restrained excitement of a man who has found the first hinge in a locked door. "Crimson," he murmured. "One would believe that if something were to bleed, it'd be obvious. But no. It is here, in the private seam, where only the small gray cells notice. This thread," he touched it lightly, and it did not move, "was placed after the curtain was made. The dye is of a type used in the special ink for the production's preliminary pamphlet. You recall, yes, the pamphlets that were meant to suggest instability, then resilience. The same ink, a particular alloy, uses a red base that changes beneath heat. See how it glows faintly when I breathe upon it? It was not visible before. The hand that touched the paper knew the properties. The person who wore gloves moved here to leave a mark only the observant could see. I felt, for the first time, a small tremor of unease at how private the clue was, how much of the truth could pivot on such a subtleness. But why place it there? I asked. It is not a threat, not a confession. It is barely a signature. Poirot's little mustache quivered, because the author of this act desires control of timing. To reveal too soon gives away the hand. To reveal never, and the truth disappears into the void. This is for me alone. It tells me that the person who placed it wanted me to find it, but to find it only if I was not looking for spectacle. They trusted the mind that sees the small wrongness, the one that listens to silence. That is why I keep it secret. If they believe their whisper is heard by no one else, they will continue to believe in their safety. And while they believe, they reveal more of themselves. We shall see what they do when the small beam they shifted creaks again. He did not, even then, speak of the possible ownership. He only allowed the hint to exist in the compartment of his thoughts, an alignment of the pamphlet ink, the private pressure of the folded paper, and now the hidden crimson thread. He bent further, and, with the edge of a small magnifying glass he produced from the inner pocket of his coat, examined the microscopic fraying where the thread met the main fabric. There, nearly imperceptible, was an impression, a tiny, triangular indentation, echoing the shape he had earlier seen on the folded scrap of paper. It was the same shape, yet from a different angle, as if the thread and the paper had once rested in adjacency over a small, sharp object. A repeated shape, Poirot said softly. The mind that uses repetition is one that expects memory to fail. They leave a pattern, assuming it will be seen as coincidence. But we, Hastings, we see. The triangle, someone used the same small device, perhaps a badge or cufflink, to press the paper, and later, in secret, to press the thread. It is a signature without a name. The little gray cells are not satisfied with the visible. They must have the invisible reaffirmed. This is why I have not presented it. It must ferment. It will cause the right people to speak too soon. He replaced the magnifying glass into his pocket and stood erect. Now, he continued, we proceed. The others will be brought into more private circles. I wish to watch reactions to gentle pressure. The one who knows of this thread, the one who placed it, will either believe invisibility shields them or will test the net again. We will have our answer. But not yet. Patience, Hastings. The secret clue is like a seed planted in good soil. It will draw those careful to water it. Chapter 12. The confrontation, the moment for which Poirot had been arranging the quiet pressure, came not with a trumpet blast, but with a simple summons. He requested the presence of Celestine Fairbairn alone. In the rehearsal salon, and while she arrived with that measured elegance she always wore like a second skin, I watched her from the threshold. There was a slight tightening about her eyes, a small fissure, perhaps, from the constant work of balancing truth and appearance. She did not speak until Poirot himself, with his hands folded respectfully, inclined toward her and offered the softest of welcomes. "Madame," he began, "we have been walking in a gallery of reflections. Some are sharp, yes. Others are blurred by the hand that would like to soften the edges. I have a question that is not about what you have done, but about what you have allowed to be done in your name." He did not yet name the crimson thread, nor the triangular impressions. He allowed them to hover like quiet instruments tuned, waiting for the precise moment to be played. Celestine took her fan from her sleeve and opened it slowly, the motion deliberate, as if measuring each breath. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. You treat the theater as if it were a confession booth. I confess that I am interested in truth. I do not confess to crime. If you wish to speak of the ways I have shaped performance, speak. If you wish to speak ill of my disagreements with Miss Kent, you have my candor. But I will not be made a puppet for those who hide behind their own shadows. Poirot's eyes, small and bright, held no accusation yet. "Ah, but you see, madame," he replied, "shadow is not always concealment. Sometimes it is a beacon. One who places a mark for only the observant to see does not desire to vanish. They desire to be known by one who chooses to know. The mark is a quiet conversation. The question is, with whom are you conversing, and who listens in the dark?" Celestine's fingers stilled. For a fraction of a heartbeat her veneer seemed to thin, and a flicker of something private passed across her face, concern, perhaps, of being too encircled. "I do not understand you." "Monsieur Poirot," she said, and yet the phrasing carried the weight of someone buying time. "You do?" he answered gently. "You understand the placement of things, the shaping of what is seen and what is hidden. The play above has its fold. Beneath it, someone has stitched a small crimson thread, repeated a triangular impression in secret, and placed a message meant for minds that watch more than they hear. The one who does this is not careless. They wish to be engaged. They wish to see whether the net has teeth." He paused, letting the silence take the shape of a question. "Madame, who is the one you allow to handle the hidden parts of your truth? Who do you trust to adjust the beam without telling the architect?" Celestine's fan closed with a soft click, the sound sharp in the hush. "You ask for names as if I am to betray confidence," she said, voice rising a degree. "There are many who suggest, many who advise. Is it advice that you suspect as a blade? I shape nothing without discussion. If there is a thread, if there is a mark, perhaps it is the work of a collaborator who wishes to aid, not harm. Must I denounce those who would assist in the nuance of sensation?" Poirot leaned forward very slightly. "Assistance has its manners, madame. When a collaborator places a private signature and believes only the prudent will see it, they test a boundary. When they repeat the shape," he touched the air lightly, "an invisible triangulation, they reveal familiarity. The one who did this expects a response, a recognition. They expect that the one who sees will not cry out, but will wait. That is why I do not speak of it yet. I would see. Do they continue their small drama, or do they tremble because the stage left open is watched?" Her expression shifted. The carefully arranged amusement was gone, and beneath it, the slightest, almost imperceptible tremor of worry showed. "You are threading implication, Monsieur Poirot," she said, softer now. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The silent architecture of suspicion, which Poirot had so carefully begun to erect, with small, precise moves, now began to creak under the weight of human impatience. The private interviews and the revelation of connections had loosened the carefully held facades. The suspects, each with their own internal balancing act, began to shift uneasily, seeking new footholds. Alliances unspoken earlier surfaced like pale shapes in fog. Brief glances held a fraction too long. Offhand comments carried the weight of implication, and smiles that once glossed over tension now fractured at the edges. Edward Fairbairn, who had spent much of the earlier hours a step behind the momentum of his own influence, found himself drawn forward by a combination of guilt and a fragile desire to protect his uncle's reputation. He made a casual remark in the presence of Lord Albright and Celestine. commenting on how resilient productions appeared when they had weathered inner turmoil, implying, without stating outright, that the current situation might be spun as evidence of strength. Lord Albright, however, took it differently. The observation, meant to soothe, touched the raw place of control being questioned, and he responded with a thinly veiled barb about the dangers of manufacturing struggle for show. One does not build respect by pretending one has faced what was never real. Edward's cheeks flushed, his earlier composure fraying. The exchange, small in its words, carried a sting that rippled through the room. It shifted Celestine's gaze, and Marianne, watching from a distance, interpreted the tension as evidence of deeper manipulation. Marianne Clive, fragile still from the earlier poisoning scare, was no longer merely a witness. She spoke with a quiet urgency to Lady Penelope about the odd warmth she had seen between Isidora and the patron, suggesting that affections exchanged in private had a peculiar edge, like a rehearsed embrace with one hand hiding a knife. Lady Penelope, whose generosity had long been framed as benevolent stewardship, bristled. "I give for art," she replied stiffly. "I do not demand its shape. If the performance feels strained, perhaps it is because too many hands have reached into the same pot." The implication was clear. Generosity interpreted as control, and control perceived as suffocation. Marianne, in that moment, felt the pull of being the catalyst. She had spoken of hidden pressure, and now she was being used as a mirror by both sides. Giles Morton, pressed by the earlier insinuations about Arthur Keyes and the small irregularities he had quietly managed, began to push back defensively. He spoke, with thin civility, to Celestine about the complicated demands placed upon the stage mechanics. "When the artist wants changes, I do not have the liberty to refuse," he murmured. "And when the financier expects stability, I am to deliver it without exposing the cracks." Celestine, who had previously framed such tensions as necessary friction in creation, now responded with a sharper tone than before. "You hide the cracks, Giles," she said, "and then wonder why the structure threatens collapse. The audience sees the illusion, but the ones beneath feel the strain. You cannot smooth all surfaces and still pretend nothing alters the shape above." Lord Albright, drawn again into the undercurrent, decided he would not remain passive. He approached Marianne under the pretense of concern and, with the practiced softness of a man used to gentle persuasion, suggested that perhaps she had misinterpreted the warmth with Lady Penelope. "People see allegiances where none exist," he murmured. "You are tired. Fear magnifies shadows. Isidora's behavior shifts because she is an artist, not because she is entangled in scheming webs." It had the effect of sowing doubt in Marianne's mind, and also of unbalancing Lady Penelope, who, hearing it, felt her influence questioned without explicit affront. The whisper ricocheted, and more eyes turned toward the delicate actress, now a pivoting point for the other's anxieties. In the background lay the secret clue, Poirot's crimson thread and the repeated triangular impression that had not yet been voiced. He watched all this unfold as one watches the movements of dancers on a complex stage, noting who stepped in rhythm and who faltered. He let the little confrontations proceed, letting their heated edges reveal underlying investments. The tension between Celestine and Giles hardened into a fragile alliance of convenience when both were unexpectedly challenged by Edward's implied meddling in public narrative. They found, briefly, a mutual interest in deflecting the suspicion toward the broader influence of perception, Celestine highlighting artistry corrupted by external framing, Giles insisting on the impossibility of maintaining illusion when the gears beneath were misperceived. Poirot did not intervene directly. He allowed Lady Penelope to question Lord Albright's motives in private conversation, letting her gently suggest that financing could become manipulation if the giver's name appeared in too many places. He let Edward over-explain his role to Marianne, appearing helpful, while revealing his own discomfort with being perceived as a puppet master. He observed how Isidora, whose presence had been tentative, began to withdraw slightly, appearing less willing to be seen as the center of the circling tensions. Her quiet observation of the others, gathered in brief, measuring glances, told him she felt the pressure on all sides: approval, control, suggestion, and silent accusation. The alliances, shifting like sand beneath elegant shoes, produced consequences. Words were chosen less for truth than for defense. Some remarks, born of frustration, inadvertently exposed who had the most to lose if certain secrets surfaced. The most telling, however, was not in the loudest of voices. It was in the small pause when Celestine mentioned assistance, and Giles, a beat later than natural, clarified that the assistance had never involved secrets beyond maintaining performance. The delay, minuscule, hung between them like a loose thread waiting to be tugged. Poirot, with his slight smile contained, collected the tremors. He saw that the pressure he had applied earlier, through subtle reflection and unspoken suggestion, had moved the pieces. The web was no longer flat. It had depth. There was friction where previously there had been only gentle tension. And within that friction, the person who had placed the hidden clue might reveal themselves, either in defense of a perceived threat or in the bold continuation of the small drama they believed unseen. He said little, but when he finally spoke, it was to arrange the next stage. "We see now," he told those present, "the strains. They are not cruel in intention, mes amis, but they are revealing. I ask this: continue, yes, to speak. Do not smooth. Do not hide. The little gray cells enjoy clarity, and the truth, when squeezed between these tensions, will speak. We shall proceed with further, more focused conversations. There is no need to guard the obvious. It is the invisible that betrays." The room, charged and uneasy, settled into a quieter hum, the kind that comes before another eruption, when people feel watched not by the loud eye, but by the still one that notes the small, shifting balance of everything. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. Celestine's eyes narrowed fractionally, the precise amusement she cultivated slipping just enough to show the seam beneath. "Implication is not proof, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice cool, but threaded now with something like fatigue. "A collaborator who places a private signature, is that a crime? Or is it artful caution? I allow hands to adjust, yes, but I do not command hidden dramas. If someone tests whether you are watching, and you are, does that make them guilty of wanting to be caught?" Poirot folded his fingers together, the gesture of a man offering a gentle pressure rather than a blow. "Madame, you are clever. Too clever, perhaps, for this simple stage. The difference between caution and conspiracy is intention." Yes, the repeated triangular impression, the small shape that appears more than once, speaks of a mind that expects pattern to be noticed. The crimson thread beneath the fold is not accidental. The message, placed where only the observant might see, is not meant to frighten broadly. It seeks a particular response. He paused, letting those words, soft as velvet, settle like a weight. "You know who moves the hidden pieces. I do not ask you to name them yet. I ask, why invite me to look? Who, in your circle, desires the dance to continue with you as both conductor and performer?" Celestine's fan trembled the tiniest degree as she lifted it to her lips. "You speak as if I orchestrate every unease," she replied. "I merely observe the way actors and patrons twist themselves around the idea of truth. If someone places a thread, perhaps they wish to be seen. Yes, but why would they trust that the one who sees will not ask? Are you not the one who, by asking, makes conspirators of us all?" "Ah, but if I were to shout from the roof," Poirot said, "the conspirators would hide. The one who places a secret for my eyes alone, he or she wants the game to continue under the belief no one else knows. That is its cunning. The question is not whether you made the mark, madame, but whether you allowed it to be made without asking why it would be made at all. Who do you regard as necessary to your truth? So necessary that their private signatures may be left in places only the most attentive would find." Celestine set the fan down with a soft click, the sound sharper now. "You insinuate that I sanction deception," she said, "and that I, the one who demands honesty on stage, permit dishonesty off it. There is a difference between artistry and manipulation. If someone in my circle seeks to draw your eye, perhaps they do so to divert attention from something else. Have you considered that the thread might be a redirection, monsieur? That the one who placed it is not the architect, but the decoy?" Poirot's face remained composed, yet a slight glimmer in his eyes betrayed satisfaction. "The decoy, yes, is a possibility. But a decoy, too, must be placed with purpose, and purpose requires knowledge of what is being redirected. The triangle appears in two different mediums. That repetition is not an accident of distraction. The person who does not fear being seen is not the one who leaves a nearly invisible mark. The one who fears being misunderstood leaves a pattern that reassures them it is noticed by the right mind. You understand patterns, madame. You recognize the shape of a repeated impression. That is why I speak to you alone. The net you help observe is being tightened by someone who believes the closing will come from confusion." She inhaled slowly, gathering herself, the theatrical rhythm of one who can choose to raise the stakes or let silence speak. "Then ask plainly," she said, "and I will answer plainly. Do you believe I have placed the thread and the impression myself? Do you believe I have encouraged another to do so? Or do you believe that I am, as you suggest, a mirror for somebody else's game?" "I do not believe," Poirot replied, "anything yet. I observe, I feel, I arrange. I wait for the slip that reveals whether the person who used the thread fears your watching, or whether they think your awareness grants them cover. One day soon," he added, the cadence shifting subtly, "they will move again. Their instinct will be to test whether the watcher is blind or simply patient. When they do, the tension will break. You, madame, are not accused. You are invited. If you wish to help, then consider who in your echo chamber is not content with the surface, who whispers to edges, who thinks a faint, crimson line beneath velvet is an assurance rather than a warning." Celestine's composure, which had been brittle with controlled defiance, softened just enough that Poirot noted it. There was a flicker of something like calculation. And then, with a very quiet breath, she said, "There is one who has been more insistent than usual about small adjustments. He is not usually so precise. He worries about perception. He has suggested that subtlety is the only safe path when many eyes judge a performance." She paused. "But I will not name him fully. You wish patience. So do I. I will watch him as you watch. That is the answer for now." Poirot inclined his head. "Very good. Watch carefully, madame. Do not let your desire for truth become the act of smoothing the very tension that reveals it. We are both observers. When the next movement comes, we shall see whether it is a test or a tremor of guilt." She left then, her steps measured. The fan reopened, but the slight looseness in her practiced grace remained. Poirot remained where she had stood, fingers steepled, his secret clue heavy now with potential. He did not yet speak to me of whom she meant. He only said softly, "The confrontation is not a battle, Hastings. It is a turning. The one who believes their partner in ambiguity will not speak has been given a choice. Continue with the assumption of invisibility, or shift. We shall watch the shift." Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The quiet tension that had settled after Celestine's departure was not comfort. It was the momentary stillness before a new movement. Poirot, having allowed the confrontation to simmer, returned to his observatory position, just outside the salon, near the narrow corridor where whispers could be heard without being caught, and watched. The revelation from Celestine had altered something intangible in the room. Hands that had previously rested now drifted toward pockets or clenched lightly, and eyes, once glancing, lingered. The person she had hinted at, the one unusually insistent on subtle adjustments, had retreated into silence, ostensibly to avoid being too visible, but in truth to consider a course. It was then that the alarm sounded, a sharp, dissonant note from the undercroft. A stagehand burst into the salon, breathless and wide-eyed. Someone was seen beneath the curtain," he stammered. "Arthur Keyes. He was going to the fold. He's gone now. He had a bag. He's left through the service exit." The sentence tumbled out, and in its wake the room lurched. Arthur, who had been held under light observation since the false lead, had slipped the guard. The uneasy convenience of his earlier implication now became urgent possibility. Poirot did not shout. He simply moved, the way water nudges a small stone into view. "Inspector," he said, in that soft, unflappable tone, "Arthur Keyes is not to be chased like a frightened animal. He is to be watched. He will not escape the stage so easily." He turned to me. "Hastings, come. The movement is the answer. Let us see what the anxious do when they believe the net is closing." We went swiftly, yet without the bluster of panic, down the service corridor. Poirot's small steps were measured. His eyes flicked toward the small details, the faint, dragging mark on the dust of the floor, the slight dislodging of a loose nail near the lower rigging access, the whisper of a curtain tremble. At the back entrance, 2 constables had already stationed themselves, their posture rigid with undercurrent confusion. Poirot gestured not to pursue the obvious exit, but to circle gently. "He will not run into the street," Poirot murmured. "He will move toward what he fears they will examine. He will seek to undo, not flee entirely." We followed the faint trail that led back toward the fold itself. The understage hatch was slightly ajar, the lock unlatched but not forced. Poirot's little gray cells clicked as he noted the disturbance. A small scrap of paper caught again near the seam of the curtain, creased not like the previous one, but folded hastily and tucked partially beneath the crimson thread. He retrieved it with care, not revealing the action to the others yet. The paper bore nothing but a hastily drawn triangle, its sides trembling as if drawn with a shaky hand. The repeated shape, now in frantic echo rather than measured pattern, signaled something had been hurried. Someone had come to alter, to remove, or to test the tension of the mark, and had been interrupted by the knowledge that eyes were on Arthur's path. A sudden movement behind us made me turn. Arthur Keyes, sweat beading at his temple, had not fled beyond control. He stood a few paces away, half hidden in the shadow of the rigging, the bag slung over his shoulder, his face the pale color of a man who had been pressed too tightly by accusation. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as Poirot stepped forward, his hands clasped before him, the gentlest of authority in his posture. "Mon pauvre Arthur," Poirot said softly, "you have gone to the fold. You have touched what you thought hidden. You wished, perhaps, to remove what you believed a threat to you, this little triangle, to erase the idea that someone had whispered to me in quiet code. You think removing a signature undoes the presence, yes?" Arthur's breath came in quick bursts. He looked like a man who had rehearsed 1,000 escapes and found none that did not end in the same small room. "I only went," Arthur began, stumbling, "to see if it was true. To see if the mark meant I was still involved. When the inspector blamed me, I felt the net. I thought if I could take the evidence, if I could remove what made me look tied, perhaps the focus would shift. I didn't want to run, Monsieur Poirot. I wanted to fix. I thought if I could smooth the thing that was noticed, then the suspicion would be gentler." His eyes flicked to the triangular drawing, and then to the crimson thread, as if trying to measure their relation in his mind. Poirot's gaze did not sharpen into accusation. He simply said, "You thought to mend the curtain by cutting its edge. The one who cuts in panic reveals the place most sensitive to pressure. You are not the author of the repeated shape. You are the frightened apprentice who touched what he did not understand. That is why you returned here, yes? Your attempt is the answer. You believed the one who watches would not see the trembling of the hand that removed the signature. You believed haste disguises guilt." Inspector Merton, arriving moments later, a little breathless, having been told of the attempted escape, stepped forward with a self-satisfied lift of his chin. He was trying to destroy evidence, he declared, and in doing so placed the neat narrative he desired over the more complex motion of fear. He barely noticed the small triangle drawn in panic. He did not see that Arthur's movement was less the act of a guilty mastermind, and more the cornered flinch of someone misled into thinking erasure was salvation. Poirot turned to me, and in that soft undertone reserved for private sharing, he whispered, "The desperate attempt reveals more than the calm plan, Hastings. The one who believed they could smooth, they are not the one who initiates. They are the one who reacts. The true movement will not be the cutting of thread, but the one who uses the reaction to shift blame. We now watch who, upon sensing that Arthur was shaken, breathes easier, and who tightens the hold on their own small secrets." Arthur was escorted back, not in chains, but in cautious restraint, his hands held lightly, his eyes still darting, as if expecting another shadow. The crimson thread remained untouched, the hastily drawn triangle a quiet tremor at its side. Above, the murmur in the salon had shifted. Some noticed the attempt to remove a mark, others only the sound of movement. Below, a new layer of strategy had been exposed, the mistaken belief that silence could be manufactured by erasure, and the reality that actions born of fear have their own signature, sharper and far more revealing than a planned deception. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The attempt by Arthur Keyes to erase what he believed stained him had done more than stir the waters. It had shifted their currents, and in those subtle eddies, the truth began to take a shape that was no longer vague. Arthur, pale and trembling, was led back into the salon with the cautious deference given to someone whose panic had been mistaken for guilt. The others watched him with varying degrees of satisfaction, relief, or renewed suspicion, each reaction itself a small piece of evidence, as Poirot anticipated. He did not, however, speak of Arthur immediately. He allowed the room's temperature to settle into a reflective heat, and then, as if arranging a small tableau, he had each of the principal figures reconvened, not for accusation, but for the gentle revisiting of what they had seen, what they had felt, and, most importantly, how they had reacted when the possibility of visible correction had appeared. It was here, in their responses to Arthur's desperation, that the final piece, until then lingering like a scent just beyond clear identification, slid into place. Poirot began with Lord Albright. "When the movement beneath the curtain occurred," he said, "you were quiet. You watched the boy go, and your gaze sought not the street, but the faces of those who observed him." Albright, taken aback, opened his mouth and closed it. "I did wonder," he replied carefully, "if the focus might shift, if the one useful as a shield had been moved. Perhaps the light would fall elsewhere. But that is speculation." Poirot's eyes, however, had flicked to the slight twitch at the corner of Albright's mouth when Arthur was described as attempting to remove evidence, an involuntary softening, a breath held too briefly before release. Celestine Fairbairn, sitting with her fan folded in her lap, was next. "You spoke of the net being tightened," Poirot said, and then watched as the boy touched the thread and retreated. "Did you feel what exactly? Relief, confirmation, or the sensation of the game becoming real rather than theoretical?" she answered without flinching. "I felt the movement of someone frightened by his own shadow," she said. "The one who believes he is hidden unmasks himself by fidgeting with the seams. That is all." Yet her fingers, beneath the stillness, flexed around the fan's handle in a way that betrayed the same small disturbance Arthur had caused, a tightening in the performance of composure. Lady Penelope Ashcroft, who had remained mostly silent in the earlier confrontations, was the one who provided an unexpected reflection. "When Arthur tried to smooth the evidence," she said, "I noticed how quickly others adjusted. The idea that something could be erased made them glance at their own places in the sequence. Some breathed easier, some less so. Poirot's little gray cells flickered. The final piece was not a single detail of action. It was the alignment of breaths and ease. The way the removal attempt had provided a quiet permission to relax or to brace. He was watching now, more clearly, the one who had benefited from the wobble in Arthur's position. Edward Fairbairn's reaction was layered with instinctive overcompensation. It was unfortunate, he said, that someone thought to alter what had been noticed. It makes the truth slippery, yes? One tries to hold it in place and the hands of others fumble. His hands, as he spoke, moved in a small, measured way to smooth the air between him and those who listened. He did not realize he had in the same motion mirrored the attempt to smooth that Arthur had made beneath the curtain. That mirroring, Poirot knew, was a kind of unconscious identification, an echo of a behavior one is familiar with, either as accuser or as ally. Marianne Clive, still shaky, yet more composed than before, went pale when Poirot asked her directly what she had thought when Arthur had slipped away. "I thought," she whispered, that he had gone to finish something, that he believed removing the mark would heal a wound. It was the sort of desperate kindness one uses when one does not know the shape of the pain. It made me think the net was too tight. Too many people thinking they could fix without understanding. Her words, small as they were, offered a perspective that drew the underlying pattern tighter. The final piece was not merely who reacted, but who thought themselves the healer when the wound was self-inflicted by fear. Poirot did not yet speak the culprit's name. He had instead gathered the alignment, the repeated triangular impression and crimson thread, the secret signature intended for him alone, the movement to erase that signature in panic, and the shades of relief and disruption among the key players when that panic unfolded. He saw now that the person who had placed the secret clue had not been the one who panicked. They were the one watching the panic, accepting its appearance, and using it to test the responses of others. The one who believed panic could be smoothed into innocence had provided cover. The one who breathed easier had inferred a shifting focus. The one whose composure had not only held but subtly adjusted had the most to gain in the recalibration of suspicion. He turned then, quietly, to me. "Hastings," he said, "you have seen the puzzle slightly turned. The one who placed the thread did not intend to hide. They intended to provoke. They know the others will react to the twitch, to the attempt to cut away the evidence. They are watching which of them relaxes and which tightens. The final piece, the thing that changes everything, is not the cutting, but the calm after, the one who steers the breath of others. That is where we go next." He folded his hands, the small gray cells humming with activity, and allowed the room to absorb the implication without forcing it into declaration. The stage, above and below, was now arranged with a clearer set of shadows. The players had moved, some inadvertently, some by design, and in the quiet tension that followed, the truth no longer whispered. It waited, heavy, ready to emerge when the next breath was taken too sharply or released too casually. Chapter 15. The final gathering. The evening had turned, as evenings in these matters often do, into something solemnly ceremonial. The salon, which earlier had resounded with quiet skirmishes and measured deflections, was now arranged with a different purpose. The principal figures, Celestine Fairbairn, Lord Albright, Lady Penelope Ashcroft, Edward Fairbairn, Giles Morton, Marianne Clive, and even the uneasy Arthur Keyes, had been summoned under the pretense of further clarification. In reality, the air carried the weight of something more deliberate, the gathering of pieces not to scatter them, but to set them in a frame where their relationships became impossible to ignore. Poirot had asked that the room's light be softened, not so much to cloak as to reveal. The gentle amber glow did what a well-placed stage light does, showing contours without harsh glare, making the smallest twitch meaningful. Inspector Merton, who had been given a seat at the edge, both for ceremony and oversight, watched with a satisfaction tempered by the complexity he could feel slipping from easy narrative. I stood, as usual, slightly behind Poirot's shoulder, the better to observe the precise ritual he prepared. He began not with accusation, but with the reconstruction. "Mes amis," he said, "you have all played your parts well. You have been observed, and you have observed. The evening's performance has had many acts, some obvious, some hidden. Now that the curtain is drawn back a little, let us speak about what each of you saw, what you felt, and how you moved when the small tremors occurred." He invited each in turn to recount briefly, and as they did, he did not interrupt. Their recollections, when restated in sequence, formed a pattern that had been invisible in isolated pieces. Celestine spoke with that carefully measured grace about the tension between form and truth, emphasizing the burden of shaping those who wish to change without understanding why they wish it. Lord Albright spoke of control and influence, of the desire to have the audience see an unadorned truth, and the discomfort when the appearance of that truth itself became suspect. Lady Penelope's words, gentle and veiled, traced the reciprocity of patronage, the sense that what one gives is not always received as intended, and how that dynamic could twist into quiet pressure. Edward spoke of narrative shaping, of resilience framed from turmoil, and of the peculiar anxiety that arises when the very framing becomes the subject of suspicion. Giles, careful yet defensive, described the effort to maintain a smooth surface while managing constant small adjustments below. Marianne's account, softer now, offered the emotional tension of being between wanting to help and fearing to be used, while Arthur, in a subdued tone, described the panic of being suspected and the foolishness of trying to erase a mark when what he should have done was to bring it forward. When the recounting ended, Poirot did not immediately speak. He allowed the silence to sit like a held breath, then, with the gentlest sweep of his hand, set the last piece in place. "You have all seen the movement beneath the curtain," he said. "You have all felt the shock of a hand that attempts to smooth what has been noticed. You have all felt, perhaps without naming it, the ease or tightening when that attempt failed. The one who tried to erase the mark did not originate it. He panicked. Panic is loud, yes, and betrays itself. The one who gave that panic its direction is quieter. They watched. They waited." His eyes, for the first time in this gathering, lingered longer on each face, just enough to make each person feel tracked without being accused. He turned then to the scrap of paper, now placed on the small table between them like an unspoken witness, and the faint crimson thread beneath the underfold, held in a small, discreet envelope. "The mark," he continued, "the repeated triangle, the thread hidden where only the attentive would find it. These were not placed to hide. They were placed to see who would notice. The person who placed them is not reckless. They intended to draw attention in a controlled manner. They wanted to observe the reactions when the boy, frightened, touched the wrong place. They desired to know who breathed easier, who adjusted, who smoothed the performance when the stage trembled, and who tightened their grip on control." A rustle, small but perceptible, moved around the room. Lord Albright's fingers, previously still, flexed once. Celestine's fan shifted minutely in her lap. Lady Penelope's gaze, which had been soft, sharpened just enough to betray a tightening of focus. Edward's hand, which had smoothed the air between himself and another, stilled as if caught mid-motion. Giles's jaw, which had been set in defiance, relaxed slightly, the way one does when realizing a small misalignment has been noticed. Marianne, her hands clasped neatly in her lap, watched the others with the uncertainty of someone who had become, unwillingly, a fulcrum. Poirot leaned a fraction closer to me, so that his whisper, though soft, touched only the small space between us. "The final gathering is the moment of alignment, Hastings. Watch, not for the person who sweats, but for the one who controls their breath when panic dances nearby." He straightened, and with a calm that made the room lean forward, he said aloud, "The truth, mes amis, does not like being hurried, but it does not like being hidden either. In the next moment, I will ask a question that is simple. The answer will not come only from words. It will come from the silence that follows them. He paused, giving weight to the unspoken, and the room, caught between expectation and dread, waited. Chapter 16. The Reveal Poirot's question, simple in its phrasing and heavy in its implication, hung for a moment like a held breath. He had drawn the circle tight enough that the smallest motion would ripple through the room. Then he spoke, not with accusation, but with the calm precision of a surgeon removing the bandage to show the wound. "Edward Fairbairn," he said, "you are, by profession, the shaper of what is seen. You arrange perception so that it appears natural, even when it has been guided. You told us earlier of resilience framed from turmoil. Yes, it was not a theory you offered casually. It was a plan you had seen work before and wished to replay here. You created instability to show recovery. That is why the preliminary pamphlets whispered of weakness, then strength. That is why the repeated triangle, the crimson thread, and the folded paper were placed where only the observant would find them, to test which of your acquaintances would twitch, and which would breathe easier when the noise around Arthur Keyes grew. You set a trap of perception, and when it widened into panic, you watched to see who would soothe and who would seize the opportunity to redirect." Edward's face, which had been working to keep its composure, went a pale shade paler. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, and then stopped. His practiced ease dissolved into something raw. "I was only trying to give the story shape. The theater lives on narrative. If the public believes that we have endured pressure and come through, they will respect it more. Is that a crime?" "You did not merely shape," Poirot interrupted gently. "You manipulated from behind the curtain. You did not stop at the whisper. You arranged for a second, quieter act, the attempt to frighten Marianne Clive. A controlled dose, enough to alarm, but not to kill, to pull attention inward while you watched those you suspected might see too much. You knew she had seen connections, that she was uneasy between the warmth from Lady Penelope and the pressure from Celestine. If she had been silenced, her discomfort would have been written off as fainting from nerves. You used her, yes, to add texture to a narrative of vulnerability and recover, an emotional tremor to feed the resilience arc. Edward's hands fidgeted, the practiced gestures of spin falling apart. She was scared. I wanted the audience to feel the human cost, to sympathize. It would make the reveal of truth deeper. I didn't poison her, Monsieur Poirot. I only wanted the suspicion, the tension. I only wanted to see how they moved when the stage shook." "You put poison in her tea, then," Poirot said. "Not to kill, no, but to test reaction, another private experiment in perception. A second act that would make the first seem less accidental, more deliberate, and thus more convincing when resolved. Then you placed the thread and the triangle, knowing the one who observes might see it. You did not hide it to confuse. You revealed it to invite. You wanted to see who would take the bait, who would attempt to smooth the tremor, and who would let it sit and observe. When Arthur, frightened, tried to erase the mark, you felt the shift and turned it to your advantage. You watched relief settle only in those who believed the focus had moved. And you steered suspicion toward the frenetic rather than the calm. You hoped the panic of the frightened apprentice would hide the careful hand. He lifted his gaze slowly, sweeping it over the assembled faces. But the one who profits most from such manipulation is the one who can position themselves as the savior of the story, who controls what is seen, and who benefits when the audience believes the drama has been genuine endurance, not constructed turmoil. That is why you breathed easier when Arthur's panic surfaced, Edward. That is why you echoed his attempt to smooth. That is why you mirrored the very gesture he made. The instinct of the one who has orchestrated sees the pattern and now tries to massage the aftermath into plausible innocence. Edward's mouth opened and closed. He looked not at Poirot, but at the others, as if measuring which of them might pull him back, protect him, or condemn him. Celestine's expression, previously guarded, softened just enough that Poirot noted the echo of the hint she had offered earlier, the one insistent figure in her circle. Lady Penelope's lips pressed together. She had given, and her support had been used as texture in Edward's arrangement. Lord Albright's jaw tightened. The financier had believed his influence misperceived. Now he saw it being used as a scaffold. Giles Morton, who had tried to smooth fracturing performance for preservation's sake, lowered his head slightly, the realization of being a tool in a larger shaping dawning quietly. "I arranged," Edward whispered finally. "I did not wish harm. I wished to see who would overreach, who would flinch, who would try to rebuild without understanding. If they believed the problem solved, if Arthur was softened, the story would read as redemption. I did not intend murder. I did not intend ruin, only the perception of struggle." Poirot's small gray cells had by then already done their work in full. "Perception can be a poison," he said. "So can control. You have confused the two to your advantage. The truth is not redeemed by your good intentions, Edward. It is illuminated by the clarity you tried to obfuscate. You have played the game with too many layers, and in layering you forgot the simplest. People react differently when they are innocent and when they are instruments. Panic and smoothing are not the same. The one who panics reveals. The one who smooths attempts to erase. You did both." Inspector Merton, who had until now been almost an observer of Poirot's performance, stepped forward with the official weight of the law. "Edward Fairbairn," he said, "you will come with me." There was no dramatic flourish, only the quiet implication that the play was over, and the second act had collapsed under the clarity of the reveal. Edward's shoulders slumped. He did not resist. As the constables moved to take him, he glanced once, briefly, toward Celestine, toward Lord Albright, and then at Marianne, whose recovery, small as it was, had given her a quiet, unwilling place in the unraveling, and finally his eyes settled on Poirot. "You will tell them," he said, voice low, "that it was for the story." Poirot, with no vanity, only the smallest of nods, replied, "I will tell them the truth, monsieur. The story will tell itself." Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The room, which had held tension like a taut string, loosened just enough to allow a different sound. The soft, inevitable shuffle of consequence. Edward Fairbairn's shoulders, once squared with the rehearsed confidence of a narrative architect, folded as the constables guided him toward the door. He did not struggle. The weight of what he had done, intention tangled with culpability, sat in him like a set of carefully arranged props finally collapsing under their own built-in imbalance. Inspector Merton, relieved to have the case swaggering toward resolution, announced the arrest with a formal tone that sought to lend the moment structure. "Edward Fairbairn," he declared, "for manipulation of evidence, for the attempted psychological coercion through orchestrated panic, and for the controlled attempt to frighten Marianne Clive with a substance placed in her tea, You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. The last phrase hung like a curtain drop, practiced and expected. Edward, walking past the others, paused. His eyes, briefly, caught Celestine's. There was no plea, only a recognition. He inclined his head toward Lord Albright, an unspoken gesture of having misused the scaffolding given, and then toward Lady Penelope, whose silence had been a kind of blessing, and, in his mind, a misinterpreted permission. When his glance found Marianne, it flickered with something like regret, and then landed at last on Poirot. "You will tell them it was for the story," he said again, as if the repetition might rearrange guilt into purpose. Poirot's reply was quiet, measured. "The story," he said, "is built on truth or on illusion. You have chosen the illusion and tangled it with harm. That is not the same thing." He turned away with no flourish, letting the constables lead Edward out. The moment had the peculiar flatness of a climax already rehearsed too often. The real work, Poirot knew, would be the ripples, the way the others would recalibrate their roles, the way reputations would be edited in private, and the way the audience, unaware of the intricate machinery beneath, would consume what remained of the performance with a new, unspoken layer of meaning. Lady Penelope, who had watched the proceedings with a stillness that now felt like the quiet after rain, spoke. "Control is a dangerous theater," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "One gives, trusting the light will reveal, and finds, instead, the shadows have been shaped to seem inevitable." Her gaze lingered on Arthur, who sat apart, still pale from the panic, and on Marianne, whose fragile recovery had become both witness and unintended pawn. There was, in her expression, no malice, only the weary acknowledgment that her involvement had been complex, and that giving without asking the right questions first had its cost. Celestine's reaction was layered. She did not rise to defend or denounce Edward. Instead, she watched him go with the kind of cool detachment of a director who has seen a performer overstep the bounds of the script. Later, she would claim that she had merely observed the tension and offered the glimpse, that she had not steered the outcome. Whether she believed it herself or needed to be believed was a matter of perception. Lord Albright, who had felt the tremor of influence warp beneath him, stood with his hands clasped. He had not been directly implicated, but the knowledge that his desire to shape narrative had created a scaffold for manipulation sat like a small, blackened smudge on a fine canvas. He would, in time, distribute damage control, perhaps edit the public story to emphasize resilience, the very narrative Edward had intended, but now with a more genuine foundation. Marianne, recovering with a slow steadiness, stayed seated. She had been given a place at the center and yet had been kept there by force of circumstance rather than desire. When Poirot approached her, he did not speak of theory. He simply offered a small, respectful nod, and she managed a faint smile, one of those that inhaled grace from pain. "He wanted a reaction," she said quietly. "He wanted to know who would soothe, who would stiffen. I think he thought my fear would become endurance, that it would be a tool. It almost was." Her eyes flicked to Arthur, who, for his part, stared at the floor, still grappling with the foolishness of believing erasure could cleanse suspicion. Giles Morton, who had been used as an instrument of smoothing and had felt the shifting purpose of his ministrations underneath, leaned back slightly. He had tried to protect the illusion, thinking himself guardian. Now he understood how easily guardians can become enablers when they accept pressure without question. He would have words with Arthur about the panic, and with Celestine about the boundaries of adjustment. He would also, quietly, tend the mechanisms beneath the stage with an added wariness, knowledge now supplied with the memory of being a small cog in a larger shaping. Poirot, having allowed the room to settle with the removal of the most active manipulator, gathered himself and addressed the remaining group. "Justice," he said, "is not only the removal of the hand that causes confusion. It is also the illumination of the system that allowed the confusion to proliferate. We have the truth. It has been unpleasant, but now it is clear. The next step is what you do with that clarity. Do you return to performance as if nothing has shifted, or do you adjust with the knowledge that the audience does not see the net, but the ones beneath it can still feel its weight?" Inspector Merton, somewhat chastened by the complexity that had surfaced beyond his earlier neat narrative, inclined his head. "We shall proceed with official statements," he said. "Mr. Fairbairn will be charged appropriately. The others will provide their accounts. The theater will be inspected again. The public will be told of the brave recovery from internal trouble." His voice held the practiced cadence of smoothing edges. Another layer of narrative control, perhaps even necessary, but Poirot's gaze lingered on him, reminding that the simplest stories were rarely sufficient. As the group dispersed slowly, each carrying their own residues of implication and self-justification, Poirot remained for a moment, hands folded, looking not at the place Edward had vacated, but at the curtain itself. He placed his palm lightly on the velvet, feeling the hidden crimson thread beneath, still there, intact, waiting. "The net," he murmured to me, "has caught the first fish. The river, however, still flows. There are always those who will try to smooth, to redirect, to shape. Justice is a moment. Wisdom is what follows." Chapter 18. The Closing Remark. The theater, which had once thrummed with expectation and hidden tension, settled into a quieter air, one that was not comfort, but the aftertaste of revelation. The principal players moved with the stiffness of those recalibrating their public selves. Statements would be drafted, reputations managed, and the audience above would never have the faintest inkling of the layered manipulations that had shaped the evening. They would applaud the performance and whisper of the play's dramatic opening night, perhaps even praise the resilience of the company. The truth, however, had been observed and held in small, precise compartments by those who had paid the price of knowing it. I watched Poirot as he lingered by the green room door, where Marianne Clive had been tended, her expression softer now, her color more natural. She had been offered a small reassurance by Lady Penelope, an awkward gift of support, and had, with quiet dignity, accepted it without allowing it to become a leash. Arthur Keyes, given a cautious leniency for his panicked folly, was being instructed by Giles Morton about the importance of clarity in small actions. The stagehand's role in preserving illusion now carried the added weight of vigilance. Celestine Fairbairn had gone to her private box, no doubt to compose a statement. Lord Albright was already planning subtle recalibrations to ensure the public would hear of overcoming internal tension rather than manipulation. Lady Penelope stood with a composed profile, her mind likely tracing how her giving had tangled itself into influence, and how influence, unasked and unchecked, could become a stage of its own. Poirot moved toward me, his small figure carrying none of the exhaustion one might expect. "Hastings," he said, "you see, the truth is like the stage. There is the performance the audience sees, and there are the ropes, the pulleys, the hidden actors that make it all appear seamless. The danger is not always the noise of the fall, but the quiet adjustment of the scene in the moment when nobody watches. Edward Fairbairn wished to craft drama from crisis. He wanted the audience to marvel at resilience, not suspect manipulation. He believed himself a storyteller. He forgot that the true story is in what people do when they think no one is examining their little gray cells. I nodded. And the thread? He touched the velvet of the curtain with his fingertips, the crimson line beneath still hidden from anyone who did not know to look. The thread, he said, was the invitation. The one who placed it wanted to know who saw and how they would react. That is the elegance, Hastings. A mark that is almost invisible forces the watcher to become the wielder of attention. The panic of Arthur was the drumbeat. The one who had placed the thread listened, who relaxed, who tightened, who tried to smooth the tremor. That is why the final gathering worked. It is logic, but logic dressed as theater. He paused, looking past me at the curtained stage and then beyond, to the city's evening light leaking in faintly through the high windows. "What will happen now?" I asked. "Justice," he replied, "will be the outside story. The police will file the paperwork. Edward will be taken away with the quiet assumption that all ends here. The more interesting thing is what the others do. Will Celestine continue to bend truths and let others carry her subtle tests? Will Lord Albright believe he can shape perception without responsibility? Will Lady Penelope give without asking too closely? The harm has been done. The awareness remains. That is the place where the little gray cells must not rest." He took a small step, then turned and, as was his custom, allowed a wry tilt to crease the space between his seriousness and humor. "You know, Hastings," he continued, "human nature is most curious. We think we are the authors of our actions, and then we are surprised when the audience applauds what we feared would be seen as artifice. The greatest mystery is not who did the deed, but why we convince ourselves it was for something noble when it was for appearance. The little gray cells, they do not deceive. They only wait. It is we who dress the waiting in clothes of purpose." I had learned long ago that his reflections carried more than philosophy. They were warnings wrapped in the guise of observation. "And you, Poirot?" I asked. "What do you do with the curtain now?" He smiled, just slightly, the kind of smile that did not soften the sharpness of his mind. "Only acknowledge the theater's perpetual cycle. I will let it hang," he said. "The audience will come tomorrow. The performance will resume. But I shall not leave. I will watch the small ripples. The truth is not a single reveal, Hastings. It is a series of understandings. One must keep the little gray cells awake." We stepped out into the foyer, where the murmurs had already begun to reconstruct the evening in acceptable terms. A young usher, unaware of anything beyond the surface, tipped his hat politely to Poirot, who inclined his head in return with a graceful, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. Outside, the night was cool, and the city's lights seemed distant, like stars reflected in a dark, careful pool. As we walked away from the theater, I could not help but ask, "Do you ever tire of it, mon ami? The watching, the waiting, the unmasking?" Poirot's stride was measured, his voice soft. "Never, Hastings, because each time the human heart shows a new variation. It is not the crime that interests me most. It is the reveal of motive, the tiny contradiction, the moment someone believes their mask is perfect, and then the light catches the edge. That is the spectacle. The rest," he tapped his chest gently, is merely the introduction." He paused, then added with his customary flourish of amusement, "And if you ask me, the best dramas are not those in which the villain is cleverest. They are those in which we all pretend to be innocent while believing ourselves wise. Ah, maintenant, let us go home, Hastings. I have a little supper waiting, and the little gray cells they are hungry for the next story."